the beginning was sonata and cantata. And where do we go from there? Let's find out. Hello and welcome back to Meet Mozart. I'm Angie, that's Mozart, and today we are talking all about the cantata. The term cantata first appeared in the early 1600s in Italy, and the word itself actually comes from the Italian word cantare, which means to sing. And it came about in order to sort of differentiate music that was sung, cantata, or sounded on an instrument, sonata. So if we're thinking about that very first generic term, anything that is sung could potentially be a cantata. However, just like the sonata eventually started to take on its own form and its own meaning, the cantata did as well. The first cantatas that were usually written for solo voice, although some did include a second voice or perhaps a few other voices as well. But in general, it was sung by a solo voice that was singing a selection of arias and recitatives that all worked together on a theme. Usually that theme tended to be about like nymphs and shepherds and all those cool things that people in Italy in the 1600s were into. And so cantatas became more and more popular, I think mainly because they weren't super long. It was usually just a few arias and recits, and the cantata started to take on two forms. The first was the Cantata da Camerata, which was the chamber cantata, and that usually was more on a secular theme, and it became really popular with the aristocracy. And of course, one of the most famous composers of the Cantata da Camerata was Alessandro Scarlatti, another famous opera composer in Italy at that time. The second form that it took on was the Cantata da Chiesa, and that was sort of spearheaded by Giacomo Carissimi, who was a huge oratorio at the time. And the Cantata da Chiesa focused on sacred materials, and so it was the cantata of the church. Both forms grew in popularity in Italy, and as they did, and as they were coming up at the same time as opera and oratorio, musicians from all around the world were coming to Italy to learn about these new art forms. And they started to take them back to their home countries and sort of reinvigorating the form with their own style. So French cantatas were in French, and there were lots of German cantatas in Germany. And although there was some sort of a form that had been developing in Italy in terms of deciding, how many different musical themes a composer might use and how often and when to repeat those themes, it was still a pretty loose structure. And it wasn't until it came to Germany that it started to evolve in a different direction. There was a really big push in the Protestant church to start including, along with the regular worship service music, more secular styles of music. And so the cantata was perfect. It had just a few movements, it wasn't super long, and could be easily integrated to the church service by using sacred texts. They also wanted to make sure that there would be some more familiar music for the congregation, and so a lot of the German composers at the time were starting to integrate chorales into their cantatas. And so that brings us to the most prolific composer of the chorale cantata, Christoph Graupner. Graupner wrote approximately 1,400 cantatas in his lifetime. He was primarily the Kapellmeister, or the music director, at the court of Hesse-Darmstadt. And when he first took on that position, it was a really great one. There were tons of funds, and they were able to hire all kinds of wonderful musicians. But by the 1720s, things started to change, and they didn't have as much of a financial backing, and they were starting to lose musicians to other types of employment. And Graupner was really in the same boat. He hadn't been paid for a very long time, and so he was starting to look at other positions. And it just so happened that St. Thomas Church in Leipzig had an opening. And so he applied and was offered the position of cantor, which again is sort of like a music director in a church. And so he was all ready to go to Leipzig and start his new position, but Darmstadt would not allow him to break his contract. Instead, they went ahead and paid him all the wages that were due to him. They also gave him a salary increase, and they promised that going forward, they would prioritize his salary in the budget. And so he decided to stay in Darmstadt, and St. Thomas Church offered the position to Johann Sebastian Bach. And so Bach, of course, became probably the most famous composer of the cantata. And what was unique about his situation in Leipzig was that the church felt very strongly that the congregation should be able to sort of participate in this cantata. And so he was using these hymns for the chorales that were well known to the congregation. And sometimes he might take that hymn and set it in a really complex manner that the congregation couldn't follow along with, that it was more designed as a choral work. And then he would include the recits and the arias that were still a big part of the cantata form. And then at the end, he would finish it with a more standardized, simplified version of that same hymn tune that the congregation could then sing along with. And these cantatas were traditionally presented right after the sermon, so they became a musical meditation that allowed people to absorb and meditate on what they had learned in the sermon or the gospel lessons up to that point in the service. And the other very unique thing about Bach was that he took on a project for himself, that he would try to present a new cantata every single week that would match the theme that was in the church calendar. And so in addition to Graupner, Bach also became one of the most prolific writers of the cantata. Since Bach's time, the term cantata has come to take on sort of a looser form, but there are still a few things that we would sort of consider if we were determining whether or not a piece of music was or was not a cantata. The first thing is that since the development of the chorale cantata, the term cantata usually implies that there's going to be a choir. And also there's usually still an application of soloists as well. Secondly, cantatas have started to take on more of a sacred nature, sort of following in Bach's footsteps, although there are still secular cantatas that have been written. And lastly, we would take into consideration the length of the piece. So for example, a composer might write something that they consider an oratorio, but when we look at how long the piece actually is, it's more similar to the length of a cantata, and so it could fall into that category as well. And so this term has sort of been applied by composers as desired. And one of the most famous cantatas that I promise, even if you have never listened to a day of classical music in your life, you will know this piece, is Carl Orff's Carmina Burana, which you might recognize from advertisements like this one. Carl Orff considered the Carmina Burana to be a scenic cantata. And of course, obviously, it includes some really major choir works, but there are also solos for soprano and tenor and baritone. And Carl Orff actually imagined it to be much more even than that. He imagined that there would be dancing and staging and even the inclusion of some visual arts, although today it's usually presented in a concert setting. So that, my friends, is what a cantata is. I hope you'll take a second and share some of your favorite cantatas in the comments below so we can take a nice cantata-themed trip down the YouTube rabbit hole and enjoy some really great music. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, you know what to do. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, push all the fun buttons, including that little notification bell, which I think actually might be here or here, and we will see you next time.